Hi, I'm Richard Murphy, and this is the 29th in the video series on the importance of tax transparency that I am hosting, and which is being made jointly by the University of Sheffield, where I work as Professor of Accounting Practice, the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, and the International Budget Partnership. Having discussed all 14 of the tax transparency principles during the course of this video series, it might be thought that there is nothing more to say about tax transparency, but that is not quite the case. In this penultimate video in the series, I want to emphasize a point that is incredibly important when discussing tax transparency, which is that this is an ongoing process. When looking at how a tax authority that is committed to tax transparency organizes itself, a number of issues stand out. Firstly, as I have emphasized at many points during this video series, the commitment to achieving tax transparency is one that develops over a period of time and requires that people stick with the process. This is most especially the case since, so far, there is no tax authority that has achieved all the tax transparency goals that we have noted in these videos. Everyone is on a journey towards tax transparency. No one has got there. Tax transparency is then a systemic process of change to which a tax authority that wishes to deliver best outcomes for the people in the jurisdiction that it serves must be committed to if it is to achieve this goal. It is an ongoing process. When saying that tax transparency is an ongoing process, what I mean is that it must be embedded in the cycles of tax system management that are a feature of high-level tax management in any jurisdiction. As we have discussed in this video series, the process of tax system management requires that a tax strategy should be established. Operational goals for a year have to be set. These have to be reflected in a budget for tax to be collected, which also allocates the resources of the tax authority to achieve the goal of collecting that tax. Tax does then need to be collected, which is not a straightforward process, as we have discussed. Accounts have to be prepared for tax collected, and variances from prior years and budget expectations have to be calculated, analysed, and discussed. Successes and failures have to be appraised. Ideally, this would involve the use of both tax gap and tax spillover analyses. And throughout this process, proper processes of publicity, consultation, and disclosure have to take place, after which the process begins again for another year. However, this whole process is not nearly as linear as that list implies. It is, of course, a fact that as the current tax year, let's call it year 1, is progressing, the goals for the next tax year, again, let's call it year 2, are set. It may also be the case that the results for the prior year, which we will call year 0, may not be known or may not be known in sufficient detail when the budget process for the following year, year 2, begins. In other words, the process is cyclical and requires that those involved understand that they often have to operate on the basis of incomplete or even estimated data, acting in good faith to interpret what information they have at the time that decisions are required, knowing that better decisions might be made later when more up-to-date or accurate information is available. We stress that this is not a weakness of any system that supports tax transparency. It is, instead, a reality that has to be acknowledged and embraced. Doing so is in itself a part of tax transparency. This being said, we do want to highlight an important issue from the GIFT transparency principles for tax policy and administration. There are 2 advanced techniques for the delivery of tax transparency included in them, which we have highlighted during the last 3 videos, and which we think have a particular importance when noting the issue around decision-making on tax having to take place in conditions of uncertainty in a great many situations. These 2 techniques are tax gap analyses and tax spillover analyses. Although we describe these techniques as advanced and even aspirational, we also stress that almost any tax authority can address them to at least some degree. That is in fact more the case with regard to tax spillover analysis, which can be entirely qualitatively based, than it is true for tax gap analysis, which does inevitably interpret data, at least to some degree. This is because tax gap analysis can be undertaken selectively. For example, if there was thought to be a problem with some tax reliefs or allowances, these could be studied in isolation. Alternatively, if there was thought to be a problem with the shadow economy, exercises to appraise this issue could be undertaken without having to prepare a full tax gap analysis for the tax system as a whole. We have already suggested techniques to do this in this video series. The point here is that aspects of the tax system can be scrutinized and results could be published and be open to discussion, even if the whole tax system cannot be subject to a tax gap analysis for reason of a lack of resources. Since management is always an exercise in managing scarce resources to best effect, to maximize the return made on effort, a partial analysis of this sort is, if thoughtfully and appropriately targeted, never going to be a waste of time. It is simply good management, although we would also highlight the need for publication of findings and consultation on them if tax transparency goals are to be fulfilled. This is also true of tax spillover analyses. These can involve heavyweight consultations, the expenditure of considerable time and effort, the collation of much data, and long-lasting engagements. We have trialled that approach. The results were worthwhile, in our opinion. However, we have also run workshops where we have asked informed audiences, by which we mean people with some experience of the tax system as a whole, the questions that a tax spillover analysis poses, and place time limits on the length of discussion with the deliberate intention of getting quick feedback to highlight where common ground exists between interested parties on the problems that need to be tackled when looking at the tax system as a whole. No more than a day was required to do this. These quick exercises are remarkably effective in their own way. They rapidly establish those parts of any system where there are few issues of concern, meaning no further action is required. They can also very quickly identify where people think that there are big issues of concern, suggesting that action is necessary. Differences of opinion can also become apparent, often reflecting the different interests of groups in the economy. This highlights areas where more in-depth work is required. Sometimes, a tax authority has to work on the basis of what is called the 80-20 rule. In other words, 80% of the gain has to be secured on the basis of 20% of the optimal effort. Tax spillover assessments can be managed on this basis, and real rewards can be achieved. It is also possible that online versions of such reviews may be on a limited range of issues once areas of concern have been established could be of value. Critically, whilst the ongoing cycle of regular tax system management is going on, tax gap and tax spillover analyses let a tax authority, government, or even an NGO or civil society organisation stand back and look at the system from a different angle to make sure it is delivering what is required for the people of a jurisdiction. And that is what tax transparency is all about. In summary, our message is, tax transparency is not easy, or everyone could be doing it well. But if a tax authority wants to collect as much of tax owing as possible, tax transparency is key because it persuades people to pay. This requires commitment to the tax transparency process and that it be embedded in the tax management cycle. However, precisely because the process is cyclical, standing back and appraising the system as a whole is key, and tax gap and tax spillover analyses help that process and could deliver big rewards. Good luck.